Hello. I'm happy to be here to be able to talk to you about a very interesting part of the western United States where issues around hydrologic management, water quality, farming, and other environmental uses come into constant conflict. Most of my focus is on the Upper Klamath Basin, which is a high desert region that overlaps the California and Oregon border. The Klamath Basin as a whole ties together areas that run from the state of Oregon down to the state of California, tied together by the Klamath River, which ultimately ends up in the Pacific Ocean. The Upper Basin is, as I mentioned, a semi-arid dry region, but does have significant surface water resources. The lower region is a much wetter, rain-fed area with softwood forests, particularly including the iconic redwood trees. They're more or less divided at this point in the map where at the Iron Gate Dam, or what was the Iron Gate Dam. Both water quality and quantity are contested issues, and so the really deep underlying question is whether those natural resource use, in this case by irrigators, farmers, can be maintained while also adopting broader conservation goals. The area includes both in the lower basin, salmon and other anadromous fishes, and in the upper basin, there's endangered fish species and it's important wetlands along the Pacific Flyway where millions and millions of waterfowl congregate periodically during the year. My talk has basically three parts. I want to talk about the regulatory and management issues in the watershed, and the role of irrigated agriculture, which is the core of the talk. It's based on data collected over the period from 1995 to 2000, and then some concluding thoughts about farming and the environment. The region is interesting hydrologically because of management. Basically, in 1905, the second major large-scale water reclamation project in the western United States was undertaken called the Klamath Reclamation Project by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, or Department of the Interior. This changed fundamentally the hydrology of the region. This is a pre-project picture of the ancient Tule Lake, which was the endpoint of the Lost River from 1902. And this is a current picture of the same area, which is now a very active and highly productive farming region, very fertile soils, very high yields of crops in general. So there's been substantial effects. Basically, we're focusing on the lower portion of the Klamath Project. There's more of it that exists off this map, and the relationship particularly between farming in the Tule Lake region and water and wetland conservation and farming in the lower Klamath region, and returns to the Klamath River, which is off the map here at the top. Now the area is managed under a regulation called the Total Maximum Daily Load. Basically, this is from the US EPA website. There's more information at the website, and basically the TMDL attempts to reduce the transfer of pollutants to a receiving water body to maintain standards, water quality standards in that water body. I won't go into any larger detail, but it's on the slide. You can look at it later if you're interested, and also go to the website to see how TMDLs are managed. The sources in this region are water for pollutants are for water for irrigation. These go from various inputs into the farming area. The main focus here in this study is the Tule Lake Irrigation District, where most of the farming occurs, and then transfer processes to sensitive locations, which are the wildlife refuges, and ultimately the TMDLs controls return flows to the Klamath River. Soils produce inputs, the lake sediments, historic lake sediments, produce inputs, and of course fertilizers and manures from farming produce inputs. Here you can see a picture of what this actually looks like, some of these water areas. This is the Lost River entering the Tule Lake sump, which is effectively what that wetland is called. It's a created wetland. Now, an important point to keep in mind is the soils in this region and the waters tend to be high in phosphorus, and surface waters typically in the region are naturally eutrophic. Upper Klamath Lake, which is the major water body in the system, is a shallow hyper-eutrophic lake. So let's talk now about the agriculture. What we did was to collect and analyze water samples over time during the year, quite intensively during the irrigation season and less intensively during the winter or off season. We analyzed those water samples for nutrients and other characteristics. We calculated water and nutrient mass balances based on concentrations and flows. Flows are well known because they're mostly operated by pumps, which we have records for. We surveyed farmers and fertilizer dealers about farm fertilizer use, and then we developed hypotheses linking all these factors. This is a map of the Klamath project. This blue dotted line represents the watershed divide between the Klamath River and the Upper Klamath Lake and the Lost River watersheds, watersheds 1 and watersheds 2. Historically, these were divided by ridges and elevated areas. The Klamath project integrated water between the two watersheds and transfers water back and forth, and allows for movement of water from what was originally the old Tule Lake you saw a picture of through a tunnel dug through the hill, uphill to the lower Klamath regions and farming in the Klamath Drainage District region, and then transfer back to the river here at this point. These numbers represent sampling points for surface water locations throughout the Lower Klamath project that we used for our study. We also did sampling within the farming area in tile drains and canals. Here you can see water transfers from drainage canals to wetland areas using pumps. We have pumps and pump breakers are the primary, they're used to move water all through this region and are the primary basis for volume records. Now, I'm sorry about the units, which are American units acre foot, but that's roughly 0.12 hectometers per acre foot. What counts really is the actual amounts by month. So it starts in January and it goes to December. The major input into the Tule Lake Irrigation District, where most of the farming occurs, is the J Canal, moving water from the Lost River and also from the Upper Klamath Lake. And you can see it peaks during the summer or irrigation months. The major outlet from the Tule Lake Irrigation District are these gray dots, and you can see that mostly peaks at the end of the season and water is transferred to the lower Klamath refuges. And the return flows to the river mostly peak during the late spring months when there's lots of water around at the Klamath Straits drain, and then falls off during the irrigation season and starts to rise back again at the end of the irrigation season. We modeled all these flows with a series of equations, some of which are indicated on this picture here. And you can see again the arrows for the way in which water is moving and the equations that cover the various parts of this balancing system. These are some of the equations. Now, this is complicated, and I don't have much time to explain it, but you have inputs by location, precipitation, a balancing term. You have ET losses by location and a balancing term for outputs for the watershed 1. Same kinds of equations for watershed 2. You can see internally within the system, the Tule Lake sumps or wetlands are balanced, and the cropland is balanced. There's a water use efficiency calculation, and then the two watersheds are balanced in this final equation. The details are in this report, which is cited at the end of there's quite a lot of detail in that report. So this is an example of the water balance for the Tule Lake Irrigation District. Again, it's in acre feet, but what counts is really the balancing terms. You have the inputs from the J Canal, the Lost River, from precipitation and from drainage from the farming systems in Oregon to the north that transfers into this district. You have crop ET, you have water use from the sumps, and then you have, or from the wetlands, and then you have transfers from the deep pump, and it all balances. We sampled, this is, for example, a sampling location, one of the internal canals for temperature, pH, salinity, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And let's just look at some of these results. This is the nutrient balance for the farming area in the Tule Lake Irrigation District based on megagrams per year. And this is total nitrogen fertilizer application, total phosphorus fertilizer application, both on the area and per hectare. And you have removal, crop removal, again by area and per hectare. And you can see basically that the difference is that there's a negative balance for nitrogen and a positive balance for phosphorus. There's a lot of these soils are high in organic matter and they're naturally fertile, and they tend to be under-fertilized for cereals. Here you can see now a phosphorus balance based on water inputs and outputs. The major obvious input for fertilizer within is fertilizer inputs from the TID. There's some that comes from soils in the tile drains, and there's some inputs from the water diversions, naturally occurring phosphorus in the input waters. Then crop removal is the major output, and the deep pump outflow, which transfers water from the TID to the lower Klamath refuges, is another output. In fact, you can see differences that there's an accumulation of phosphorus in the district. Now these are outflows, and again, you see water transfers from the Tule Lake irrigation's lower refuges and the farming areas, and then to the Klamath River. So this is the inputs from the drains, Lost River, and the J Canal, the outflows from the D pump, and then outflows from the refuges to the farming areas on the western side of the project, and then finally transfers from the farming this last point in the farming regions back to the Klamath River. So there's a larger amount of input than there is output. There's evapotranspiration and crop water use in here, but there's also some additional flows into this region that aren't shown in this graph. I'll show them in a minute, that make up for the difference. So here we have the phosphorus transfers in the lower Klamath region. You have, these are direct inputs into the lower project from the Klamath River near where the return flows occur, back into the farming regions on the western side. Here's the inputs into the Tule Lake irrigation district. These are the outflows from the D pump, and again, the return flows to the river. So you can see that basically phosphorus is being retained in the system compared to what's returned, what comes into the system, and is what's returned to the river. The same is true for nitrogen. You can see more nitrogen coming into the system than is actually returned to the river. So these wetlands and farming areas act as sinks for these major nutrients. Now, salinity, TDS, nitrogen, and phosphorus concentrations certainly did increase as water moved through the watershed in our measurements. But the quantity of nitrogen and phosphorus leaving the lower project and discharged to the river is less than the amount entering the project, and that includes fertilizer. Farming in the TID area did not really affect water quality and discharge into the Klamath River when you do the mass balance and do the calculations. So surplus fertilizer appears to be accumulating in soils and sediments within the project despite apparent over-fertilization. Nitrates certainly are lost, especially in spring, from tile drains, and there's some under-fertilization on average. But despite that, some nitrate loss is unavoidable when they're farming these high organic matter soils. And some modification, certainly if the fertilizer practices were modified, especially with respect to phosphorus inputs, there might have a small effect on, but a significant effect on surface water quality is unlikely from that source. Total nitrogen and total phosphorus concentrations probably, or we think most likely, reflect the dynamics of nutrient cycling in shallow surface waters. That means the canals, the lakes, and the streams in the area. Then more than the influence of nutrients lost by farming and other human uses. Higher nutrient concentrations measured at specific times of the year appear to be much more closely correlated with the volume of water transferred in the pump turbulence and sediment resuspension rather than inherent ecosystem processes. So let's finish with a few comments about regulatory issues. In a large watershed like the Upper Klamath Basin, in which human activity results in only a part or even a small part of the pollutant load, how much should that activity really be limited? If the assimilative capacity of the receiving water body, in this case the Klamath River, is small or is considered saturated by regulatory agencies at background levels, does a TMDL limit mean that farming can't be effectively, there can't be any further human impact to the river essentially effectively eliminate farming, but it'd still be possible. Given that protecting the waters in the river are still an important goal, our TMDL is really useful in this area. So you have measurement errors, of course, associated with assessments at this large hydrologic scale, and they're cumulative, and they're sufficiently large to make meeting a standard, exact standard anyway, difficult in practice and potentially over-restrictive, especially if they're overestimated. If yearly, and also we have large yearly and multi-year climate variation. Short-term regulation makes it difficult or a TMDL somewhat ineffective at this ecosystem level. And there is a large amount of year-to-year variation in the Upper Klamath Basin region. These are measurements based on estimates based on centuries of treeing data. Go back 1,000 years. The areas in the Upper Basin are highlighted by arrows here. This is the outflow at the Klamath Falls. This is from the Klamath River. Here you have the Klamath River at Keno, which is slightly downstream, which is basically the end point of the Upper Basin. And here is a major tributary of the Klamath River, the Trinity River. And you can see, really, the point is that there's this enormous variation of drought years and wet years and average years over time across geologic time, effectively. That influences certainly the hydrology and nutrient loading in the river. And here you can see reconstructed flows at Klamath River mouth over, again, quite a long period of time. This is in a report to the Department of California Water Resources. You can see large periods where there was large flows, large periods of drought or low flows, and then intermediate regions that have occurred commonly. So it's a common characteristic in the region. So to conclude, in the southern portion of the Klamath project, return flows may be reduced more effectively by other means, but this would, but they're really likely to have small effects on the actual quality and loading of the river. But it would more rationally make pollution control a seasonal or yearly activity rather than a short-term or daily one. And since this study, dam removal and sediment discharge of the river has moved massive amounts of phosphorus and other pollutants in the main stem. What does this mean? It was done, dam removal has just recently occurred to extend habitat for salmon and steelhead and other anadromous fishes, basically around 100 miles or 150 kilometers, 160 kilometers of habitat in the main stem river has been created by the loss of the Iron Gate Dam, which is the boundary between the upper and lower Klamath Basin, and the main stem river in this region. This reach has been now extended to the Amazon. You can see here, the removal of the Klamath River dam removal and the Copco Dam removal before and after, and you can see very significant effects here. Again, this is the region in the whole hydrologic system that we're talking about and have been talking about in this talk. Now, the quantities of water in the river are quite significantly different at different points. This is logarithmic scale, so the amount of water at the Klamath River outlet is an order of magnitude greater than the flow in the main stem river, Klamath River here in the upper Klamath Basin. Here's a chart that actually gives amounts in acre feet and hectare meters per year, and this is 1,480,000 hectare meters per year at the Klamath at the ocean. The main stem itself, the main stem river, above the major tributaries, is roughly 10% of that. And the diversions for agriculture in the upper Klamath Basin altogether are just roughly 3%. But since there's return flows, it's roughly, basically, when you get down to the amount used by farmers and irrigation districts, is roughly 2% of the water, and that's the water that's contested. So to conclude, these issues are still contested. They're still important. The TMDL does remain in effect, though its effect on the transfers in the lower portion of the river of the system where most of the agriculture occurs, and to and it affects those return flows, which have been limited in recent years, and also, as I've mentioned, probably not significant relative to loading in the river. What is still at use and at issue and contested by farmers is and uncertain is the water supply that farmers have to use. That's really still a function of ongoing political contest among tribes, environmental organizations, and state and federal agencies. And water users are increasingly losers in this contest. Thank you very much.